So we are finishing 7-6. And in 7-6, we are going to see shifts. So we have not done this yet. So y equals 2 sine of x minus pi over 2. Now, what this is going to do is we're going to talk about all the different pieces and how it affects our graph, right? This right here is still going to affect only the amplitude. So amplitude is still going to be 2, which if I think about it, my amplitude affects this, the height from the midline, which by the way, my midline has always been y equals 0 so far. That will change today. My amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top and from the midline to the minimum. And it's been 1. But when I have that 2 here, it makes it go, oop, they should hit the same spot. This now becomes a 2, and this becomes a 2. That's what the amplitude. So that's old. That's what that's going to affect. But now, what the heck? How? So this is my amp. Still 2. My period did not get changed, so my period is still 2 pi. That means that to complete this, it would take 2 pi, or if it's the cosine graph, which starts up, and then finishes up like this. This is what a cosine graph looks like. It would still be 2 pi. My period did not change. All right, so none of that changes. But what the heck? How does this do that? That is called a phase shift. Just like we've done all year long. And a phase shift moves it right and left, and it moves the opposite direction. So this is actually going to move it to the right, pi over 2. So I'm going to do my OG in red, which would be y equals just sine of x, or they call it theta. You might see it as theta. It doesn't matter. This would be, so then it would be theta y. It doesn't matter if it's an x or a theta. They just want you to know it's the measure of the angle that you're going to be putting in there. So if I did my OG in red, it would look something like this, which would be, this would be 2 pi, this would be pi, this right here would be pi over 2, and this right here would be 3 pi over 2. Well, with this phase shift and with this change in my amplitude, everything's going to move to the right, pi over 2. So normally my point is here. It's going to move over pi over 2. So that's where that point is going to be. And now this point is going to not only move over, but it's going to be amplified. So instead of just going up to 1, it's going to go up to 2. This point right here moves over, so it becomes here. This point right here moves over, but it's also amplified, so it goes down to here. And then finally, I need an extra one of these, which if I count by pi over 2, this is 1 pi, this is 2 pi, this is 3, this is 4, so this would be 5 pi over 2. And it returns back to there. So it goes like this. So it goes up, through here, through there, and it would continue that pattern. If I went over another pi over 2, it would go all the way back up to the maximum. If I went over another pi over 2, it would go down back to the midline, and it would continue that pattern. Same back here. Continue that pattern. Does that make sense how this phase shift affected our OG? Does it make sense on how our amplitude affected our OG? Any questions on that? Thumbs up if you got it. If you don't, if you have questions, let me know. I didn't see many thumbs up. All right. And right here, This would be what would happen if I did a phase shift, but I also did something else. So I'm going to change the phase shift just a little bit. Notice I'm using pretty easy phase shifts because I'm not trying to trick you guys. Notice this is still a sine. So the sine is the one that starts at 0, 0. So it's going to look like this. Whereas if that was cosine, it would start up and go like that. So that's one of the differences for sine and cosine. Sine starts down at 0, 0. Cosine would start at 0, 1. And then this right here, how does this affect? Well, my amplitude is in front of the sine, and there's nothing there. Well, so it's just a 1. So it's just like my OG. My period, though, this affects the period. In fact, I take the reciprocal of that, and I times it by 2 pi. The 2's cancel out, and I realize now my pi is going to be my period. So for this graph, normally that takes 2 pi to do that. But for this graph, it's going to be pi, which makes this pi over 2, which makes this pi over 4, which makes this 3 pi over 4. Now what's going to happen here is all these points are going to be shifted because I have a phase shift. They're all going to be shifted to the left pi over 2. So that means that this right here is now going to be back here at pi over 2, negative. This point right here is going to be at negative pi over 4. And this point right here is going to be at 0, shifting it back a whole pi over 2. This point right here, this point right here will be here now. And this point right here will be back there. So it's going to look like that, where I shifted everything a pi over 2. That's what this affected. Well, I'm sorry, that's what this affected. This made so that it happened, a whole cycle happened in just a pi versus a 2 pi. Did that make sense? Thumbs up. Callie, did you have a question?
Not necessarily. I'm looking back, like, cause I missed like a couple of days because of testing, so I'm just a little out of the loop anyways. I'm just trying to get my notes together, but
Okay.
I think it makes sense.
Okay. All right, so now let's apply one more thing. So that was the phase shift. Now what happens when we have this? That is still going to affect my amplitude. So my amplitude is going to be 2. So the amplitude is from the midline to the maximum. This spacing right here is going to be 2. From the here to here, from the minimum to the midline is also going to be 2. And so far, our midline has been the x-axis, but that's going to change right now. My period doesn't change because there's nothing in front here, so my period is like the OG, it's still 2 pi. But this right here, I have a vertical shift. And it goes up 3. That includes everything. So now my midline, which was normally the x-axis, is now 1, 2, 3. This is my midline. I didn't have any phase shifts, so I don't have to worry about that. Normally this is a sine, so sine starts at normally 0, 0. So instead of being at 0, 0, it's going to move up 3, so it's going to be at 0, 3. And then when I go over, normally this completes a full cycle in 2 pi, which means half of that would be pi, which is where the full up would be completed. This would be pi over 2. This would be 3 pi over 2. So normally this would only go up 1, but since I'm amplified, it's going to go up 2. So that's going to be where this is going to go. Right here, it's going to go back to my midline. Right here, it's going to go down 2 from the midline. Right here, it's going to return to the midline. And so my graph would look like this. And again, it would continue that pattern over and over. Does that make sense? All right, now let's put this all together. So we're going to take our time on this one. We're going to kind of do it each individual and then put it all together at the end. We're going to kind of slowly build this graph. So what if I had like sine of 2 or 2 sine of x over 2 plus 3? Well, let's look at all the different things that it's going to affect. This would affect my amplitude. So my amplitude is no longer 1, it's going to be 2, which that changes the distance from my midline to my max, and it changes the distance from my midline to my minimum. That's what the amplitude, that's what I focus on. I go, okay, that's changed just a little bit, it's by 2. This right here, I really want to see this as 1/2 of x. Well, what is that going to change? That's going to change my period. My period for this one, we take the reciprocal of that, which would be 2, and then we times it by 2 pi. So my period for this one is actually going to be 4 pi. Again, just to review what that means, is normally this completes an up and a down in 2 pi. Well, that's saying that this one takes 4 pi to complete an up and down. What does that? That means that it's going to look more like this. Oop. It's going to take a 4 pi to complete a full up and down. Notice, though, they both have, because I'm saying that they both have that amplified of 2, they're both going to have the same max and min. So that's what changes when I talk about the period. And then finally, this 3 right here is going to make a vertical shift up 3, which means really my midline is no longer y equals 0. It's going to be y equals 3. All right, so let's deal with the period first. So let's build the period. My period is 4 pi. That means half of it is going to be 2 pi. That means half of that, where the maximum will happen, is going to be at pi. And the halfway point between 2 pi and 4 pi is going to be 3 pi. Does everybody understand how I use my period to get those x values? Next, I'm going to shift everything up 3. 1, 2, 3. So this is where my midline is going to be. And again, since this is a sine function, it's normally at 0, 0. It's now going to be at 0, 3. Notice there was no phase shift. There was no shifting of this right and left. And then what this tells me to do is go up 2. So from this, at this point right here, it's going to be up 2 from the midline. So it's going to be there, back to the midline, down 2 from the midline, back to the midline, and then it's going to repeat that pattern over and over again. And there's a sketch of this. Notice you only need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. And then it just repeats that pattern. Thumbs up if you understand how I built that one. All right. What does this change? Come on, someone help me out. What does that change?
Amplitude.
And so what's my amplitude going to be for this one?
4.
Good. That means the distance from the midline, wherever that thing may be, to the maximum will be 4 spaces. Correct? What does this change?
The period.
Okay, you have been awesome the last couple of days, girl. I appreciate you. I just want you to know. It does change the period. What we're going to do to figure out the period is we're going to reflect or reciprocal that. 1/3. We're going to then times it by 2 pi. And when we do that, we get 2 pi over 3. So this one's going to be a little bit more of a pain in the butt to figure out my x stuff. But if I know how to do fraction work, it's not that bad. That's why I've been asking you all year long to really work on fractions and stop getting away from them, because eventually when you get older, there's nothing you can do. You have to deal with them. And finally, this thing is going to move everything up 1. So let's deal with the period first. This thing is going to complete 1 full cycle in 2 pi over 3. Where is the halfway point? Well, if you take 2 pi over 3, and basically you're dividing it by 2, we're like, scratch that. I don't like to divide fractions. So I'm not going to divide by 2. Instead, I'm going to times by its reciprocal, or 1/2. And when I do that, that gets me to 2 pi over 6. And I go, that's okay. I know how to deal with fractions. I can simplify this. That turns into a 1. That turns into a 3. So really, this is pi over 3. And I go, okay. Where is the maximum going to happen? The maximum is going to happen at the halfway point between 0 and pi over 3. So that means I'm going to take pi over 3 and divide it by 2, aka times it by 1/2, which is going to tell me that this is pi over 6. What that means is this is a pi over 6. This distance is a pi over 6. This distance is a pi over 6. And this distance is a pi over 6. That means you are adding pi over 6 each time. So if you take and you go pi over 6, this would technically be 2 pi over 6, but we know that reduces to 3 pi, or pi over 3. Then that would technically mean this one would be 3 pi over 6, but we can reduce that, and that really reduces to pi over 2. And then if we added another one, this would turn into 4 pi over 6, and yet again, that can reduce by 2 and turns into 2 pi over 3. So there's how I use fractions to figure out all the x values on my x axis. Does that make sense on how I broke this period up into where the max, where it's going to hit, and where the min, and where it's going to hit back? Next, I'm going to deal with my vertical shift, and so everything, the midline is no longer at y equals 0. My midline is going to be y equals 1. So boom, 1 is going to be where this midline happens. And then normally my cosine, remember, this is tricky. My cosine is the one that starts at its maximum value. So it normally starts at 0, 1, or I'm sorry, yeah, it starts at 0, 1, but everything has been amplified. That's where my maximum is. And it's also been up 1. So here's where it would be. And so I'm going to go, normally it would be at up 1 from there. So it's going to be amplified by 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's actually going to start up there. I don't know if I did a very good job of explaining that. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. So right there. Cosine starts at 0, 1. So it normally starts 1 above the midline. So there's the midline. So it should start up here. The problem is it's been amplified, so it's got to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. So from here to the midline has to be a distance of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Because that's the maximum value. The cosine starts at its max. It goes to the midline, so it's going to intersect here. It goes down to its minimum, which would be 4 from it. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to be here. It hits the minimum, goes back to the midline, and then goes back up to its maximum, which would be 5. And again, would continue that same pattern. That one's tricky because the period, also because the amplifier, or because it's cosine, so it starts up. How'd we do? Questions on that one? All right, last one, and then I'm going to go ahead and post the Chapter 7 review, and you can get working on that, or you can ask me questions about this graphing stuff. Finally, y equals -3. Oops. Sine of x plus pi over 2 minus 2. This one has everything basically that we've talked about. This right here tells me that it's a reflection. So that means since this is a sine one that starts at 0, 0, so normally it would do this. Because it's a reflection, I know it's going to do that. Okay, so I have that in mind. That's what that negative in front tells me. It's going to start down. Then this thing says that there's going to be an amplitude of 3. That means the distance from the midline to the max will be a distance of 3. And from the midline to the minimum will also be a 3. That's what that tells me. Okay, I'm showing you what each one of these things tells me, and then I'm going to build a graph based on those key factors. This right here tells me that there has been a phase shift. Since it's opposite of what I think, it's to the left, pi over 2. That means everything is going to be moved this way, pi over 2. And finally, there has been no period change. So sorry, that's not finally. There's been no period change. There's nothing there, so it's still a 2 pi. And then finally, it's a vertical shift, and it's going to be down 2. Does everybody understand how I knew all of this stuff over here? Because based on that stuff, I'm going to make a graph. So let's first start with our period. The OG period would complete its cycle in 2 pi, which would make this pi, which would make this maximum happening at pi over 2, and would make this minimum happening at 3 pi over 2. Now, why is this a little different? Because everything is going to be phased, a phase shift over pi over 2. So this right here is no longer going to happen. It's going to happen here at pi over 2, negative. This maximum is no longer going to happen at pi over 2. That maximum is going to happen at 0. This pi is no longer going to happen here. It's going to happen here. And this minimum is no longer going to happen there. It's going to happen at pi. And this ending for the phase, or for the full period, will no longer end up 2 pi. It's going to end up pi over 3. Because the distance between negative pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, this from here to here is 2 pi. That distance from there to there is 2 pi. All right, so now I've thought about this. I've kind of taken care of that. I've taken care of my period. Now I need to think about my vertical shift. So everything, instead of being at y equals 0, is going to be my midline. It's going to be at y equals -2. My amp is going to pump it up. So normally this would be at 1. So that sucker is going to shoot all the way up to 3. And finally, I need to reflect it. So that means instead of going up first, it's going to go down first. So having all that in mind, here we go. So I'm going to move my graph over a little bit. And this is going to be, oops, I need to do this too. It's going to be down 1, 2. There's my midline. The other important things are pi over 2. 0 is going to have another one. Pi over 2 positive. This is negative. A pi and a 3 pi over 2. Those are going to be where the main points happen. Since it's sine, it's going to happen. It starts right on the midline. Since it's reflected, I know it's going to go down first. 1, 2, 3. And this amplitude from here to here is going to be a distance of 3. Then it's going to return to the midline. Then this is going to be the maximum. And so from the midline, it's going to go 1, 2, 3. So it's going to hit right there. And then it's going to return back to the midline. And so it's going to go like this. And would continue doing so. So that would be a quick sketch of that graph with all of, I've reflected it, that's why it's going down first. There's an amplitude of 3, that's why the distance from the minimum down to here is 3. I phase shifted, that's why everything, it's not only here, that's why everything is back, pi over 2. Still has a period of 2 pi, and everything is down 2. Thumbs up if you understood.